Savile Row has been dressing the most powerful men in the world for 250 years through bespoke tailoring, suits cut by hand, canvassed by hand, fitted to a single body, and never intended to fit any other. Lord Nelson, Winston Churchill, the Prince of Wales, every British monarch worth knowing. For most of its existence, the street was untouchable, the single global benchmark for what a suit could be. And for the better part of the last 2 decades, significant portions of it have been owned by Hong Kong and Chinese conglomerates. This isn't rumor. The addresses are public record. The acquisition prices are on file. The chairman of the companies that bought these tailors gave interviews about their ambitions. What's remarkable isn't that it happened. What's remarkable is how quietly it happened, and how few people who walk through those doors have any idea. The story of how Savile Row was acquired by Asian capital stretches back 150 years, long before any of the deals were signed. It begins not with a billionaire and a checkbook, but with a nation that decided it needed to understand everything the West knew, starting with what it wore. It begins in Japan, and it ends, as these stories often do, not with conquest, but with collapse. To understand what happened to Savile Row, you first have to understand who was watching it, who was learning from it, and who, eventually, decided it was time to own it. In 1868, Japan made a decision. The Meiji Restoration, as it became known, was not just a political event. It was a national program of deliberate transformation. Japan had watched the West accumulate power, and the conclusion it drew was stark. To survive, Japan needed to become more like the West, not in spirit, in structure, in technology, in dress. The emperor himself cut off his topknot in 1872. When the Emperor of Japan cuts his topknot, his loyal followers do not hesitate. Men across the country switched to Western suits. Women adopted Parisian styles. An imperial mandate required all government officials to wear Western clothing at official events. The Japanese were not imitating the West casually. They were studying it with the precision that would later define their manufacturing, and the place they studied most carefully was a single street in Mayfair. Japanese royalty had been customers of Henry Poole and Company on Savile Row since 1871. By 1923, Henry Poole had been awarded the warrant of the Imperial Household of Japan. That relationship between a British tailor and a Japanese royal household was not simply a transaction. It was a transfer of knowledge, of technique, of what made a bespoke suit structurally sound, what made a lapel roll correctly, what a floating canvas does to the chest, what made a shoulder sit the way a shoulder is supposed to sit. Houses like Huntsman and Sons and Anderson and Shepherd were developing their own house styles during this same period. Huntsman had a military-influenced suppressed waist, Anderson and Shepherd a softer draped shoulder, giving the street not one standard but several, each one the product of accumulated craft knowledge that took generations to develop. The Japanese did not just wear the suits, they took them apart to understand them. There is a word in Japanese, sabiro, which means business suit. It is the word used today in offices across Tokyo every morning. Sabiro is the phonetic rendering of Savile Row. The Japanese word for suit comes directly from the street that built the standard. That is not a coincidence. That is documentation. Japanese tailors learned their craft from British tailors who had followed the empire across the globe. And those skills, once absorbed, were passed on to China. In the Ningbo region of Zhejiang province, a guild of skilled tailors began learning Western garment construction from British firms in the late 19th century. These men, known as the Red Gang tailors, apprenticed under craftsmen trained on Savile Row, absorbing structured shoulders, hand-stitched lapels, and the curved chest construction that defines a properly made jacket. The fabrics these craftsmen worked with were sourced from British mills, the same cloth merchants supplying Savile Row itself, houses like Holland and Sherry and Dormoy, whose rolls of worsted wool and superfine weaves were the raw material the entire tradition ran on. By 1896, Ningbo tailor Zhang Liangtong had opened one of the first Western suit shops in Shanghai, having trained directly in Japan. By the early 20th century, Ningbo tailors had opened more than 400 suit shops along the major roads of Shanghai. They dominated the city's tailoring sector. In China today, the highest regarded books on tailoring are still written in Japanese. Chinese tailors still learn the language to further their training. The knowledge chain is direct and documented. Britain built the standard. Japan studied it until the word for suit became the name of the street. Japan taught China. And China, quietly and methodically, became one of the world's foremost producers of the garment that Savile Row invented. The students had become masters. And the next question was inevitable. If you've mastered something, why rent it? Why not own it? The Fung family built one of the most powerful trading empires in Asia. Their grandfather started the business in 1906, using the salary he earned teaching English to fund his first venture, exporting porcelain and silk between East and West. That family business grew into Li and Fung, the world's largest supplier to consumer brands, a logistics and sourcing operation so vast that it quietly underpins the supply chains of companies, including Walmart. By the time William Fung turned his attention to Savile Row, the family had the capital, the connections, and the patience to move very carefully. They operated through a Hong Kong-listed vehicle called Trinity, and they didn't announce what they were building until it was already built. The first acquisition came in 2008. Kent and Kerwin, the tailor that kits out Princes William and Harry with their polo attire, was purchased through Trinity and given a flagship address at No. 2 Savile Row. The move attracted relatively little attention. Kent and Kerwin wasn't the most famous name on the street. It was, however, a foothold. 4 years later, Trinity took No. 1. Gieves and Hawkes at No. 1 Savile Row, founded in 1771, isn't simply a tailor. It's an institution. It holds royal warrants. It dressed the Duke of Wellington, Admiral Lord Nelson, and Winston Churchill. The suit Nelson was wearing when he died was made by Gieves. The address, No. 1 Savile Row, isn't coincidental. That's the number that was purchased along with the brand for £32.5 million. The Fung Group wasn't finished. Through Fung Capital, the family's private investment vehicle, they'd already acquired Hardy Amy's at No. 14, the fashion house that had dressed Queen Elizabeth II for decades. Then, in September 2013, Fung Capital purchased Kilgore at No. 8, the tailor whose clients include Daniel Craig, Jude Law, and Hugh Grant. In the space of 5 years, the Fung Group had come to control numbers 1, 2, 8, and 14 Savile Row, 4 of the most storied addresses on the most famous tailoring street in the world, all owned by a Hong Kong conglomerate. The stated ambition, delivered by the chief executive of what they named Savile Row Brands, was to acquire at least 5 Savile Row houses and develop them into global, ready-to-wear labels sold through luxury department stores worldwide. There was a detail, though, that explained what this was really about. Prior to the full acquisition of Gieves and Hawkes, Trinity had already been operating more than 100 Gieves and Hawkes stores across China. The brand accounted for 20% of Trinity's total sales. For a business that sold itself on British heritage, the United Kingdom made up only a small fraction of revenue. China was powering the business. No. 1 Savile Row wasn't the market. No. 1 Savile Row was the proof of ownership. The address was the credential that justified the price tag on the product being sold 10,000 kilometers away. And then, just as the Fung Group had assembled its portfolio, another buyer arrived. This one was not from Hong Kong. This one was from the hometown of Confucius, and this one had a very different idea of what Savile Row was worth. Jining is a city in Shandong province in eastern China. It is best known as the birthplace of Confucius. It does not appear frequently in the history of luxury fashion. That was about to change. Shandong Ruyi Technology Group had its origins in a state-owned woolen mill. Chairman Qiu Yafu had started as a worker in state textile factories in 1970, eventually rising to lead an operation that had grown into one of China's largest textile producers. By the mid-2000s, he had decided that making fabric for other people was no longer enough. He wanted to own the brands. The ambition was stated without embarrassment. Shandong Ruyi would become China's LVMH, not an imitation of it, not inspired by it. The Chinese equivalent of the most powerful luxury conglomerate in the world. To get there, Qiu spent more than $3 billion in the space of a few years. French fashion brands Sandro and Meiji went first, bringing the entire SMCP group under Chinese ownership. Aquascutum, the British luxury trenchcoat maker, followed. Then Bally, the Swiss luxury brand. Then Lycra, purchased from the Koch brothers. A 41% stake in Renown, a Japanese apparel company, came next. Each deal was announced as a step toward the larger vision. And in 2017, Shandong Ruyi purchased Trinity Group from Victor Fung for approximately $284 million. With that transaction, a textile company from the hometown of Confucius took ownership of #1 Savile Row, Gieves and Hawkes, the address that had dressed Nelson, that had cut the suit Churchill wore during the war, that had held a royal warrant for the King of England. That address, and the 250-year-old business inside it, now belonged to a company whose headquarters sat in a provincial Chinese city. Qiu Yafu told Reuters in 2018 that LVMH was the company's role model, and then added, with what reads now as significant understatement, that they were still a far cry from it. Investors who visited Shandong Ruyi's headquarters during that period described being impressed by upmarket decor. You would expect more in a global capital than in a smaller provincial city. Executives spoke expansively about their international plans. The vision was real, the confidence was genuine. The debt, however, was growing. What Qiu had not fully accounted for was the condition of the brands he was buying. Gieves and Hawkes had already been struggling with rising costs and a stagnating market before the acquisition. Aquascutum had peaked many years earlier. Turning around heritage brands that have lost commercial momentum takes, as one retail analyst put it at the time, a good plan coupled with a lot of money and patience. Qiu had the money. For a while, he had the plan, on paper. What he did not have was time. And what he was about to discover was that $3 billion spent on fading names does not build an empire, it builds a debt. The number that ended the dream was $4 billion. That's the figure Shandong Ruyi had accumulated in debt by the time creditors began to act. Standard Chartered, the bank that had extended financing to Trinity Group, filed a winding-up petition after the company defaulted on a bond repayment. The amount in question was 250 million euros. Trinity couldn't meet it. What followed was a period of quiet desperation that the financial press documented in real time, but that most people watching the luxury industry didn't fully register. Liquidators were appointed. A search began for a buyer, any buyer, for the brands inside the Trinity portfolio: Gieves and Hawkes, Kent and Kerwin, Cerruti. One source described a fruitless attempt to find another Chinese business with links to Shandong Ruyi that could take over the tailoring companies. That search came to nothing. In January 2022, Trinity Group was put into liquidation. The business that had stood at #1 Savile Row since 1913, that had been founded 250 years earlier to dress the British Army and the Royal Navy, that had cut the suit on Nelson's back on the day he died, was placed in the hands of administrators. A senior source described what had happened as the responsibility of a failed Chinese corporation with foreign ambitions. Gieves and Hawkes was saved. Barely. The buyer was Fraser's Group, the company owned by retail billionaire Mike Ashley, the company best known as the parent of Sports Direct. The oldest bespoke tailor on the most famous tailoring street in the world was rescued by the owner of Sports Direct. Hardy Amy's wasn't saved. the fashion house that had dressed Queen Elizabeth II, that had costumed Stanley Kubrick's 2001 A Space Odyssey, that had stood at number 14 Savile Row for decades, closed its Savile Row store in 2019 and was permanently defunct by 2024. Here's what this story actually is, when you step back far enough to see the whole of it. Japan spent 150 years learning everything Savile Row knew. It absorbed the technique, the hand stitching, the canvas construction, the way a properly structured bespoke suit is built from the inside out, refined it, and built something that now competes with the Row on craft alone. Japan earned its place at the table through mastery. China moved differently. Chinese capital did not come to Savile Row to learn, it came to own. And the distinction between those two things turned out to matter enormously. Buying a heritage brand does not transfer the heritage. Owning the address does not confer the authority. Savile Row spent 250 years building something that cannot be acquired through a transaction because what it represents was never for sale in the first place. The students studied, then they bought, then they lost it. And the street, battered and diminished but still standing, remains.